What is the God frequency?
963 hertz. 9 plus 6 plus 3, that's 18. 1 plus 8 is 9. The whole set of these numbers, pretty much like, think of it, 432, 4 plus 3 plus 2, 9. 7920, 7 plus 9 plus 2, 18. Look at the yugas. I said 864,000 for the Dwapara Yuga. 8 plus 6 plus 4, 18. 1 plus 8 is 9. The Treta Yuga, 1,296,000. So 1 plus 2 plus 9 plus 6, 18. 1 plus 8 is 9, over and over again. Here is the diatonic scale. So you've got, for example, the octave of C vibrates at 528 cycles per second, 528. The G vibrates at 396 cycles per second. So there's G and there's C. The original circular church was 39.6 feet. Take the 39.6 times 10, you have 396, which is the vibrational rate in cycles per second of G. C is 528. Add a zero onto that, now you got the number of feet in a mile. Now, where's the origin of the mile? I've looked it up, I've tried to find it. Nope, I can't find anything. It's just apparently very, very old. We can go to Stonehenge, and Stonehenge is laid out on a geometric template. If you draw a circle around the outer face of the big Carlson stone sandstone circle, it's right at 105.6 feet. That's the diameter. So if I was going to recreate Stonehenge, I would go out and I would draw a circle 105.6 feet in diameter from a center. And then for the blue stone, which is a rhyolite stone, I would draw a circle that's 79.2 feet in diameter. Or the radius, my chain, my rope, whatever I'm using, would be 39.6 feet in radius. And I would draw a circle, and I would now have 79.2 feet, and that is the diameter of the blue stone circle within a few inches at Stonehenge. The outer surface, 105.6, multiply that times 5, what do you get? You got a calculator on your phone? Try that. Put in 105.6 and multiply times 5, 528. So if you multiply it by 50, you've got a mile. Is that a coincidence?
No.
And then the average distance between the big Carlson stone uprights, the lintel length, is also 10.56 feet. So it looks like they were using a unit of measurement that was a sub-multiple of a mile when they built Stonehenge 4,000 some years ago.
What is Stonehenge?
What is it? I think it's part of an ancient technology. And that's the only thing that makes sense to me. I think all of these ancient structures that are using this orientation to the heavens, that's what they've got in common. They have a common geometry, a common orientation, and there's another factor too. It also seems that they're not located randomly. They're placed auspiciously with respect to the geometry. He's written a number of books on the geomantic principles behind the siting of these ancient structures, and he's documented hundreds of sites and shows to a high, more than is coincident, that they are located with respect to the geological structures, particularly fault lines in the earth, which opens up an interesting realm of possibilities because there's other research that suggests that
frequency and vibration.
Yes. And fault lines, a fault line is different, say, than just a fracture. Fracture, you've got a crack in the earth that's static. But a fault line, those rocks are moving with respect to each other under pressure. And that right there creates interesting possibilities in terms of the effects on the geomagnetic field. I'm in the infancy of trying to figure this out. There's other people who've gone further than I have, but I think it's part of the whole canon of principles that are employed in these ancient sacred structures. Number one, you get somebody out, and I'm a believer in geomancy. I've seen it work. In my building trades, I have seen what are called dowsers at work and seen major companies, government agencies, others that have actually almost secretly employed water dowsers and diviners to determine what. My first experience was in about 1974-75. I got hired to build a pole barn, and so the client had bought 15 used telephone poles that he had, and he called me and said, is there some way we can use these to build a barn? I said, yeah, well, let's build a pole barn. We'll put the poles into the ground vertically, and then I'll just frame a structure onto this thing, you know. I'll run purlins around to tie them all together. I can build a roof. I can finish it off, all of that. And he said, okay, so we had a building site there where I was going to build this barn. Back then you could call Ma Bell. This was the telephone company that handled North Georgia, right? Call them up and they would charge $8 a pole. They would send their auger truck out. They would drill the hole, and then they used their boom, and they would set the pole for you. Pretty good deal. So we had 15 poles. So what I did was I went out, I figured out the layout of this, and every place I was going to have a pole, so I had it 3 rows of 5 each. That was the 15. And I remember they were, like 15 feet apart or something. Anyways, at each point where I wanted to put a pole, I drove a stake in the ground. So I had 15 stakes in 3 rows. There's 2 guys up in the front of the cab in their Ma Bell uniforms. And then in the back, this guy gets out. He's real tall, skinny guy. He might have been 6'5", 6'6". Overalls and an old wrinkled hat, carrying what looked like a violin case. Gets out of the back of the truck, comes walking down, looking aside over. And these other 2 guys are standing up at the truck. I'm standing aside there, you know, while he comes out. He opens up his case, and he takes out 2 swing rods. There's different ways you can make swing rods, right? What he had done was he had taken the old-fashioned automobile antennas, you know, the telescoping kind, and had a little ball on the end. And he had 2 of those, and he'd cut it off so that the larger outer sleeve was about maybe this long to where you could grip it. And then he bent it at 90 degrees, and so it was free to swivel. So he goes and he starts walking with the swing rods, holding them in front of him over each of the stakes I had driven in the ground. And as he walks them, now meanwhile as he's walking, they're just kind of gently swaying back and forth. He steps over them, and as he'd step over each stake, he'd holler up to the guys at the truck, clear. All of a sudden, like almost as if somebody had grabbed the ends of those swing rods, yanked them into an X, and then they bent. They bent, like I could see him bending, literally bending down. And then he took a couple of steps off, and they relaxed, straightened up, and went back to just... Then what he did was he walked in a zigzag fashion, and every time he crossed where the water main came in, he'd get a response. And I could see it. I could see the response, and it was pretty impressive. Just then the owner comes out, and he says, yeah, I think the water main does come in right there. And I'm looking at it, interesting. Then he turns to me and says, you want to try it? He gives me those swing rods, and I go walking. I stepped across that point, and I felt like I got, you know how you like if you get a strong charge of static electricity? Mm-hmm. That's what it felt like. It felt like somebody grabbed the ends of those rods and swung them into an X. Now, I've tried it since then, and I've gotten a response, but never like that first time. I mean, I don't know. I was caught off guard or something. And maybe it also had something to do with him being there. Now, since then, I've known probably 6 other people. I gave several lectures to the Appalachian Society of Dowsers back in the 90s, and I got to know a bunch of these people that were like literally like contracting out to, you know, building contractors, to other things, literally people who were paying them money. And, you know, if you read the scientific literature, you know, it's skeptical. They have these tests where statistically there's no indication that there's any greater effect of that. But I totally think it has to do that there's really subjective things going on here. First of all, I've tried it a lot since then and gotten mild responses, but never anything like that first time. It was actually shocking to me. But after that, I came to believe, yes, there are these energies, and humans can detect them. We know animals, changes in the geomagnetic field. And why is it so incredible that moving water underground, or moving water in a fault line, or 2 mineral or crystalline deposits moving at each other couldn't create enough anomalies or fluctuations in the geomagnetic field that they could be detected? I wasn't there, but I knew guys, Marines in Vietnam, and they used dowsers to find landmines. Underground tunnels, find landmines, And you can actually see the pictures of these guys. They would not be using this if it was just all BS. Now, circling around, I think these ancient builders were using something similar to determine, like, for example, when they put that pole in the ground, it wasn't just placed randomly. You can look at some of the temples, like Chartres Cathedral is a good example, which I highly recommend. Chartres Cathedral. There's a series of fault lines that intersect directly under the holy altar. And you can go down, there's a crypt down below the altar you can go into, and there's a well. And you can see right down into the well, the water table. If you take that flagstone pavement, which is the floor when you walk into the cathedral, the height of the vault, it's like roughly around 120 feet above the paving stones of the floor, is the same distance above as the water table is below. Is that a coincidence again? See, these kind of things, you can multiply them over and over and over again. And you get to the point, well, okay, so maybe we should hypothesize that there's a method to this madness. I can't say that I know what it is. I think we're kind of in this phase right now where we're essentially trying to reverse engineer what these peoples of long ago were up to with all of this stuff. And I ultimately think it's technological.
It's fascinating stuff.
I mean, I got pictures I could pull up and show you right here of my 15 poles. took pictures of it.
I mean, that brings us into, I think, plasma technology.
Yeah.
Lightning bolt technology.
Yeah. Lightning bolts, that's plasma. Ball lightning, the sun is plasma. Aurora borealis, the northern lights, is plasma. It's the fourth state of matter. It's what happens when the electrons and the neutrons become completely disassociated. Solid, liquid, gas, degrees of freedom between electrons and neutrons, right? Even in a gas, there's still bonds. But when you get to plasma, they completely break free. So now you have electrons, neutrons become ions, and because they're electrically charged, they can be influenced by magnetic fields. And they also have this tendency to self-organize under the right conditions. If you apply the right frequency, it's like they spontaneously organize into toroidal forms. And then what happens is that, if you look at a torus in cross-section, it looks like an infinity sign. Visualize a sphere with a North Pole and a South Pole. And now let's say you collapse that sphere so that the North Pole and the South Pole meet at the equator. So now you've got this like indentation in the north and the south. Well,
like
what
two
happens?
cones.
Yeah, like cones. They're like cones, right? But what then happens is that you get this electron or ion or both stream starts spiraling down that funnel, and as it's spiraling down, it's increasing and increasing in rotational velocity. Now, in the northern hemisphere, say, it's going clockwise, and in the southern, it's going counterclockwise. And they meet at the equatorial plane. And that's where something really interesting happens that I don't understand. Something happens there that's almost supernatural. And I can't claim to know what it is. But that's the basis of the plasma technology. One of the preeminent inventors and developers of technological applications of plasmas. I hadn't decided yet whether he was for real or not, but I'd been talking to him distance for over 7 years, and his story never changed, right? And I took careful note of that, and I began looking at some of the things that he claimed as sources, and they all checked out. Going back to Nikola Tesla, right? Coming up through like half a dozen other researchers that had worked in some capacity trying to develop technologies around this plasma energy, like learning how to contain plasma and then extract energy from it. And I'm not going to get into all the details because it's a pretty wild story, but I go on Rogan with Graham Hancock. Graham invited me to go on with him. We'd been on there before multiple times. Well, anyways, before we go in, he says, because, Graham has been attacked left and right by the mainstream guys, the archaeological establishment and all. He says, let's not get into talking about ancient technology. Okay, if you don't want to, I'm fine. I'm happy to talk about mass extinctions or giant floods or asteroid impacts or whatever. I'm sure, yeah. Then the issue came up of the ancient builders and how they moved 200-ton stones. So Joe is like, well, did they have some technological means? And if you go back and watch that in November, they kind of like both look at me. I'm trying to not talk about it. And Joe, no, whoa, come on, what do you know? So I mentioned that, well, I'd been talking to this inventor for about 7 years, and he's been developing these technologies using plasma, and it's frequency-based. And at this point, I already knew that the thunderstorm generator, and I'll show you pictures of one now that's been retrofitted on a 300-kilowatt generator on a substation outside of London. And they're testing the damn thing. And it works. It does what it's predicted to do, right? I mentioned that he was on an island where he'd gone because there had actually been a couple of attempts on his life. He was an oil prospector, and he discovered oil in Tasmania. And one of the big oil companies was trying to wrest the license away from him. So they did a whole smear job against him, started paying off journalists and Tasmanian government officials and stuff. Now, one of the things is leading up to this, when I'm still like, okay, should I be believing all of this? He had told me that because of what the history of these kind of alternative energies not making it out, he decided he was going to use a different strategy. He was going to open source everything. All of his notes, and he had spent 7 years writing up his notes, several thousand pages of notes and schematics and diagrams. He had patent applications. All of this he was going to open source. When he first called me, he told me this. He said, I've been working on this plasma energy, and it's based on frequencies, and these frequencies are connected to these ancient sacred numbers. And he said, I watched a podcast, and it was you giving a lecture, and you were talking about ancient numbers, and the numbers you were mentioning were exactly the numbers that I found made this technology work. For example, the ratios of the spheres have to be in the ratio 4 to 3 to 2. And if they weren't in those proper ratios, you didn't get the effect. So he's telling me all of this, and said, you know, the reason I'm reaching out to you is because I'm thinking you're probably one of the only people in the world I can talk to about what I'm doing. So then I had this invitation to go back on Joe's to talk about the technology. Well, here I had the inventor right here with me, so I contacted Joe and I said, I've got the inventor with me. You want to bring him on? He said, sure. So myself, him, George Howard, who I mentioned earlier, runs the Cosmic Tusk website and so on, he went with, and Jamie had found this stuff from the 90s and the early 2000s online, where it goes back to this controversy where they were trying to get the license away from Malcolm. So it was basically a series of hit pieces. He called me, we had this long conversation, and he said, yeah, I spent 4 years investigating Malcolm. So all the stuff he's telling you is real, and I've seen the technology work. That boosted my confidence quite a bit that this was all real. Basically what happened was I had this slideshow we had put together, this paperwork Jamie puts on. So Joe was looking at this stuff when we just walk in. Now he knows nothing about any of this except what he's seeing is that, you know, trying to portray Malcolm as a religious nut and a bunch of other weird stuff that I'd already seen, you know, and I'd talked about it with Roland Perry, and he said, yeah, this was all part of this smear campaign, just like they've done with Graham Hancock, just like they've done with all these people. You know, you try to discredit them. The key here is this. Even if all that was true, which it isn't, but even if it was, the technology works. His invention works. I knew that there was a whole series of testing coming up the next summer, which was last summer. And I was present at some of these tests and saw for myself what was happening, and was able to, there with an admiral, a retired admiral from the Indian Navy, flew all the way over from India to be there present at this testing that was at a major industrial laboratory at one of the research labs out in Raleigh, North Carolina. That's all at this point that I can say about it, but until the final test results are published. But I was there, saw it working, saw 2 generators, a control generator, and one with the technology. I watched as the engineers and the scientists there calibrated them both. And then I was the one who went up and started both generators. They're both in 2 separate rooms. Started the technology on one of the generators. So we've got readouts. We've got gas analyzers there, probes going up into the exhausts of the generators. We've got a couple of guys there with mass spectrometers hooked up. So we've got multiple ways of determining what's coming out of the exhaust pipes of these two generators, right? I go up there and I flip the switch on the one that has the thunderstorm, I'll call it the thunderstorm, the plasma generating retrofit to it. It was I think it's called a Cane 5 something because it measures 5 gases: carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, other hydrocarbons, probably like methane and whatever else, and oxygen. Flip the technology on. So as you're watching it, here's what happens. The carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, and nitrogen oxides start going down. Oxygen starts coming up.
Interesting.
CO2 zeroes out. Carbon monoxide zeroes out. The nitrogen oxides go down to just a few parts per million, as does the other hydrocarbons. Oxygen tops out at over 20, I don't remember exactly, between 20 and 21%, which is optimum percentage of oxygen for pure unpolluted air. So what is now coming out of the generator, the generator with the technology, is pure unpolluted air.
No kidding.
No kidding.